this, it's not one AMC can only have one ELSS fund. We obviously at Motilal already had an ELSS fund. We've been running it for many years. So essentially, we as an AMC cannot do it. But I would push all of you to. I think there are new AMCs coming in the market, so maybe you could just shout out to them and make sure that at least one of them, introduce an ELS in the next fund, because I do agree. I think that is a maybe like a Nifty 100 or I think a Nifty 500 ELSS fund, can do wonders for a lot of people who are looking at simpler products.
Right. I think a lot of us are waiting for that one.
Yeah.
Right. So the next question then, can you tell us some operational details about how mutual funds work under the hood? So I have some specific questions if you want to go into that, or maybe you would like to give an overview.
I mean, there's like so many aspects, right? So I think, if you could just go through maybe one level detail and maybe something specific, and maybe I can answer that, because there's a lot of things that happen under the hood when it comes to running a mutual fund or running the passive fund, and also there are different things when it comes to international fund versus domestic fund versus asset allocation fund. So it's a fairly obviously the idea is for the customer. It looks quite simple, but on the background, there are a lot of people, hundreds of people working in the background, ensuring that every trade is marked, and every sort of customers getting the units on time and all of that. So I think there's a lot of stuff happening in the background. But maybe if you could ask me a specific question, then I can maybe relate to that.
Of course. So specifically, I have a few ones. So how does a fund house work when orders are coming in during the market hours? Is it fully automated, or would manual review be required?
Oh, no. I think it's a combination of both. I think in terms of how the fund house works, I'll give you a bit of a very overall sort of picture about how a mutual fund works. So you obviously have a mutual fund which has a license from the regulator, and essentially that license allows us to launch these mutual funds which are formed as a trust. So essentially, it's a mutual fund AMC, which is actually getting fees from that trust. So all your money is actually locked up in the trust, and the trust has its own board of directors and board of trustees and all of that. So ensuring that there is sort of I think an arm's length between the AMC, which obviously wants to make money, and the trust, which is responsible for the investors' money. So I think that's extremely important structure. So essentially, what happens is the AMC is the one that's running all the processes, to ensuring all the money is, I think, invested well in all the underlying funds. So essentially, you have a compliance division, which ensures that every single operation, every single fund manager, salesperson, also marketing, is aligned to and make sure that he or she is maintaining all regulations stipulated by the regulator. So the compliance division is actually very important. And I actually feel bad for the compliance division, because when things are right, no one really pats them on the back. But when things go wrong, everybody just points fingers at the compliance. So I think compliance is extremely important. Then you obviously have a sales team, and within the sales team, and this is where I would say most of the employees would be held in the sales team, because if you look at India, all of you, I would say most of you, essentially are buying, I would say, funds directly, from an exchange, or from I would say like a app, or I think from the mutual fund website. But most people, to be honest, go through advisors, and the sales team job is to make sure that they have good relationships with these advisors all over the country. There are about 15,000 IFAs. They have around 100 to 200 wealth management outfits. They have, I would say, at least 15-20 of these national distributors, which are brokers. So essentially, you're looking at a sales team which ensures that their products are aligned, and they establish relationships, and also make sure that their relationships are always updated with whatever's happening with the AMC and its products. So the sales function is quite fundamental. Then you have the fund management team. The fund management team is essentially the ones that take a call about which stock to buy, which stock to sell. Yes, for passive funds, we don't really have a fund management team. We have one person who essentially ensures, and we will be adding one more this year because of the number of funds that we have today. So ensures that I think the tracking error of these funds are minimized, and ensuring that all money has been invested in the right way, making sure that we track the index in the best possible way for the customer. So that is essentially a fund management team. Apart from that, you also have a technology team, so we have a running website, which we will be revamping soon. We have an app. So I think you have a whole stack of technology people ensuring that there's a lot of automation happening in the background, in addition to obviously running the website and the application and the platforms. And lastly, you also have the ops team, which I think is extremely important. The ops is the team that ensures, all, again, the ops has to liaise with the compliance team to ensure that all regulations are met. But at the same time, its main job is to make sure that, I think they work with the custodian, which basically holds the securities for us, for our customers, and also works with the different parties to ensure that, I think the NAV is declared on time, and the funds are invested in the proper way, and all the disclosures are met. So I think the ops team is quite central. So these are basically the 5 or 6 departments in the AMC, which could go to a couple of hundred people. When you look at an AMC as big as ours, which is managing close to maybe 45,000 crore in assets. So I don't know. This is just a very broad overview of how the AMC works. I hope this is.
Thank you. That pretty much covers it all. Just one follow-up question. So I believe recently SEBI has changed rules around NAV allotment, right? Has that affected order processing at the AMCs in any way?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a good regulation. Yes, there was a fair bit of scrambling because the AMC is heavily dependent on something called an RTA, which is the registrar and transfer. Basically, the RTA is the one that is essentially looking at I think they are in some AMCs the customer-facing sort of department, and a lot of the processes within the AMC is outsourced with the RTA. So essentially, what happens is the RTA has a lot of legacy technology, so it's not able to, I think, change quickly. So there was a bit of a scrambling, but I think overall it's a good step forward because back in the day, the problem is that as per the previous regulations, and this covers like many things in this change, but the most important change was that before, if someone transacts before, I think 2:45 or something, then they have to get that same day's NAV. The problem for the AMC is that a lot of times when you transact at 2:45, the money might come in at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. So the problem is that we are not able to invest that much money, and this doesn't really make a big difference to active funds. But for passive funds, you can't afford to do that because then we're holding cash and we are under investing our assets. So I think the new regulations are good. It means that we only invest if the money comes into the AMC or the trust sort of bank account before I think 2:45-3. So we are increasingly telling our investors to invest earlier on the day to ensure that money comes in. Only after it comes in, we invest and issue units after. So I think it's great overall, for the industry in terms of, I think it makes it simpler. But at the same time, yes, there's a lot of technology sort of backend that needs to be changed, which took some time, and now I think it's great.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear from what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the people here found that to be some new information. So we have another question from the audience. It goes like, what was your interest behind going all in on the index funds? So you had mentioned the other day that with the current AUMs, the index funds are a loss-making venture due to the transaction cost. So isn't it a very big risk that you have been taking on?
Yeah. I think that I need some clarification. So let me answer the second one twice. The index funds are not loss-making in the sense that if you look at the expense ratio of some of the domestic ones, like Nifty 50, or I think when you are pricing your products in the same range as what the US market is, the Indian market, obviously the transaction costs are quite high, and by transaction costs I don't mean the brokerage and all of that. I actually mean when a customer buys a mutual fund through say BSE Star, or when he or she buys a fund through some platform, there is a lot of fees that an AMC has to pay per transaction. So for example, and the actual execution of index funds is actually not that expensive, but the customer facing, so essentially if you see most mutual funds in India have a minimum of 5,000 rupees minimum 5,000 rupees, and we are the only ones, I would say. Now there are more coming in, but we took a call in say 2019 that we don't want this to be only available to I would say maybe someone who can afford to put in 5,000, but someone who's able to do 500,000, 300 rupee SIP. So we took a call of I think building the business in such a way that let's first invest in and get sort of customers and get transaction, and then we can figure out the economics. So we underestimated the cost of managing sort of assets when people are putting in 500,000. So I would say, as of maybe a few months ago, our average ticket size is around between 500 and 1,000 rupees. So I think most customers would come in that range, which is great because we're helping a lot of our investors sort of come into these funds and I think really start the wealth creation process. But it's fairly expensive for us, which hopefully will be solved with time as things get cheaper and fees get lower. So I'm optimistic about that. But current the way it stands, yes, if you are pricing your funds at 10 basis point, which is 0.1%, 0.2%, 0.3%, it is not really you really need a lot of scale. At the same time, we obviously are lucky because most of our AUM at MO is in international funds, where actually it is profitable. Obviously, not as profitable as I would want it to be, but even though we are pricing our products quite attractively, it's still obviously it will take time for us to break even with that. So I think overall, yes. You need scale in this business for it to survive, and but the thing is, if you look at the US, when Vanguard started in the 1970s, they priced the index funds at 80 basis points, 90 basis points, 1%, and over the last 30 years, they've slowly brought it down to say 5, 6, or 4. So India, without the scale, we've already pricing our the index funds ETFs. So for example, a Nifty 50 ETF is like 0.05%. So you're looking at the cost itself of being 15-20 basis points. So I think what I'm trying to say is that yes, because of competition, you will see, which is good for the customer. You will see cheaper funds coming to the market. But what really requires in this industry is scale. And so far, we haven't really seen it. You've seen trends where ETFs have grown from 5,000 crores to 2 lakh crores, 2.5 lakh crores. But honestly, if you look at the actual trends, if you don't include, say, pension funds, then ETFs index fund is still a very small market, about 40, maybe 50,000 crore, whereas the mutual fund industry is 10 lakh crore, 11 lakh crore. This is only the equity AUM. So I think it's a very small base, and we would require the space to grow at least 10, 15, 20 times for AMCs to take a chance in making money. But it will happen. I'm obviously positive. I don't think it's a risk because even though it's not very profitable at this point in time, even the costs are quite minimal. We're lucky as an AMC that we have a very thriving sort of actively managed vertical. We are the second largest PMS provider in the country. So currently that's sort of subsidizing our business, which is great. But I think over time, as and when we scale, we see more profitability coming in. And we're very lucky also because we've grown a lot in the last 2 years. So we were probably zero AUM, or maybe like 250 crores 2 years ago. And this includes a NASDAQ fund where I remember we were just a 150 crore fund in about a year and a half ago. And now obviously it's a large fund. So I think from just the way we've grown, I think we're very positive for the future. So that's the first question. I think the second question was, how did I get into this? I actually used to, head operations and finance at a fintech company in Silicon Valley in San Francisco, and we were essentially, this might be digress, but we were essentially creating solutions on top of index funds and selling it to advisors. Obviously, passive is a big deal in the US, and we used to essentially take a passive fund and put an option strategy on top of it and sell it to investors for better risk-adjusted return. It's basically like a wrapper which helps you, I think, mitigate downside in case the market crashes. And it's a very popular product out there. So we did pretty well. We sort of raised VC funding, and we scaled up AUM in a very big way and all of that. But when I came to India, and this is in 2018, end of 2018, I saw that no one really knew what passive funds were. No one knew what index funds, ETFs were. There were like maybe a handful of ETFs back then, and liquidity was really poor. I think it's still not that great, but it's better than what we had in 2018. So I thought, I think this is a great segment to be in. I think it's definitely going to be big one day, and there's not really any AMC that's focused in this space. Now, obviously, a lot of AMCs coming in, but back in the day, I think we were the only ones who were there. And we, in fact, launched, I would say, 6 funds just in 2018. Actually, 19, no, 18, 19. And those are now obviously doing well. But essentially, the idea was really because I have this really good experience in the US, so I'm trying to get as much of that experience to India. So we'll be launching a lot more products in the next few years, which are very similar to what you see in the US, and also international funds. When I came to India, I thought that no one was really talking about international funds. Everyone was underinvested. We had a Nasdaq fund that was like delivering 25-30% return year over year for the last 8 years or 8 years, and EUM was like 80 crore, 90 crore, and I was like, what are we doing? We should be selling this for diversification, not for return, for diversification, and that has actually panned out really well. And it was fairly difficult actually, because everyone in 2019 was like, "Arey, who's going to buy international fund?" No one understands that. And now everyone's sort of coming in. So I think we sort of created this ecosystem that now obviously a lot of people are going out there and buying stocks. But I think back in the day, it was really difficult. Going out there. I think I must have done some 50 or 60 talks on what is an index fund, how does it work. I still do it, but a lot less than it was 2-3 years ago. So I think overall, it's a good segment to win. It's very customer centric. I think people want simpler solutions, and especially when there's so much chaos happening in the active space where you have 5,000 funds. So I think this definitely makes the job of an investor a lot easier.
Yeah, thank you for such a great answer. The growth of the AUM and index funds has been phenomenal, and the returns have definitely made the investors really happy. Nevertheless, the index fund don't really end up in top percentile or the star ratings that the investors are very particular about. So, isn't that what if the AUM growth is restricted because of that? Do you see as a threat because the funds don't end up in the top percentile star ratings?
Yeah. I mean, that's honestly a great question, and I have some very extreme answers to that question. I think star ratings is absolute BS. I think investors should not be looking at star ratings at all. I have done, if you look at guys like, I don't want to piss off anyone, but if you look at a lot of these star rating companies in the US, no one really looks at them anymore today than they did, say, 5-10 years ago, because it's basically a product of hindsight bias. What does that mean? It means funds that are high performing will get a higher star rating. Funds with a low performance will get a low star rating. And it was, in fact, I think 2 years ago we did some study where what we found out was, if you actually when a rating of a fund goes from a 4-star to a 5-star, that's when you should sell the fund, because that's when you know that the strategy is peaked out. So essentially, I think star rating is something which investors really should not be looking at. They should be looking at that in addition to other things, which I think is extremely important, like the fund management strategy, the long-term track record, and really, I think is a fund manager really sticking to their strategy during good and bad times. So I think star rating, to be honest, is not really the best metric for you to choose mutual funds. And index funds, it means, the whole definition of index funds is that you're buying market returns. What is market returns? Market returns is average returns. So index funds. So the reason why index funds don't sell in India is because by buying an index fund, the investor is accepting mediocrity. So, and no one wants to accept mediocrity. Everybody wants to buy a fund that's 20%, 25%, 30%, 40%. The problem with I think chasing returns is that, and we've seen this over the last 10-15 years, that it never ends up good for the investor. In fact, I think there's some online platform, I forgot the name, they've done a study, and it's in the US, not in India, is that when you switch a fund from a low performing fund, say you're to a high performing fund, your actually returns actually go down by 2% below the low performing fund. So switching to a high performing fund from a low performing fund is not a good strategy. It actually leads to a lower return, which is why I think the best thing an investor can do is just to hold on. If you're buying an actively managed strategy, just ensure that the fund manager sticks to his philosophy and sticks out that there is not really that much style drift happening, because it's impossible for a fund manager to continuously outperform the market year over year. It's virtually impossible. Every strategy has its ups, has its downs. Last 6 months, if you held a quality strategy, then you would have underperformed. Last 6 months, if you held PSU stocks, you could have done phenomenally well. And so value has now, I think, outperformed growth. Maybe we can talk about this later on. But essentially, there are periods in the market when your strategy will not work, and you just have to make sure that you hold on to the strategy and not really keep switching strategies. It's like someone give me an analogy of the toll booth. So when you're driving a car and we're trying to switch lanes in a toll booth to go towards a faster lane, you realize that you actually end up in a slow lane, and your lane which you switched from is actually going faster. So that is literally what happens in investing as well. A lot of investors keep churning their portfolios, keep churning their mutual funds, but essentially the best strategy is to hold on and not do much. So I think, as I said, investors should not expect index funds to be top performing, because you're accepting the market, which is average returns. The good thing about index funds is that you'll always stay average or above average at all times. You'll be in the second quartile because you're saving fees as well. And by staying there consistently over time, you'll actually outperform the average or outperform most investors. At least this is what been proven in the US. So I think, as I said, yes to both, but also investors should stay cautious when they're taking in the funds.
Yeah, I think we had Axis Blue Chip Fund also facing the same. Initially, it was one of the highest. It was the best return fund, but then it slipped down to the worst position among its category.
Yeah,
The best thing to do is to hold on to the fund that we are invested in. I think Chasing Lakshmi here has an interesting question regarding the same. You are up, Chasing Lakshmi.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, exactly. I think investors should, should not be chasing, and I think they should just give it time. If they've done some research, and if they're not just really, buying the highest performing fund, then they should just ideally just stick to it. And because most funds, to be honest, unless you are stuck with a sector fund, it's very hard for you to really do badly. If you're buying a diversified mutual fund, you will do well. Obviously, at times you'll do really well, at times you'll do slightly bad. But unless you're stuck with a sector fund like an infra fund, or like, I don't know, I mean, some fund with some sector which is not doing well, you are honestly fine. And if you see that the fund manager is changing his philosophy and they're doing something different, then obviously you should think about changing and doing something else. Even the Nasdaq fund, we released a letter in 2020, I think end of 2020, because we saw this herd type behavior that people were just pouring money in the Nasdaq fund, and we said that please have low expectations. Your fund is not going to deliver 26-27% CAGR over the next 10 years. It's it may happen, but it's a very small probability. So if you're expecting that, you will be disappointed. So I think it's important to have fairly low expectations. Also, maybe 12 to 15% is relatively good. If you get more, great. If you get less, then it's fine, because you are investing in index. So I think it's important to have low expectations. It's important to have, I would say, very, I wouldn't say average, but logical expectations when it comes to buying a mutual fund.
Sure. So, Prateek, hi. This is Chasing Lakshmi.
Hi.
One question that I have is, okay, so you mentioned star ratings are complete BS, and an investor shouldn't really go by that. But if, let's say, I am investing in an index fund like the Nifty 50 or Nifty Next 50 or the N100, etc., right? just by virtue of the timing of my investments, I could have a better XIRR than someone else, so I could have a much worse XIRR. The fund performance itself doesn't really matter. It is also down to investor sentiment, and that is something that you had also shared in one of the articles, and I believe it was an Axis study that I think you had shared 2-3 days ago on this forum. So my question is based off of that. So most investors, as per that study, most investors have a lower return from a fund, XIRR with all cash flow dates, than the fund's own return, CAGR, from the first date of investment. Given this, how does an investor beat the returns from his own fund? Would an SIP help him deliver better returns? Or would you suggest that an investor look at investing more during dips? Would it be helpful if you actually share some data or examples around this?
Yeah, I think there is a possibility of outperforming your funds. I can give you an example of a company in the US that has managed to do it for 20-30 years. They've beaten the benchmark while only investing in passively managed funds, which is great. But let me first talk about your first question, which is what happens to investors? Why is there a big discrepancy between fund return and investor return? And there's this interesting study by Dalbar Inc. in the US. I would say that you should take the study with a pinch of salt. It is sort of biased, but I think it is relatively true in terms of what happens. So why do investors? And I think if you look at the study, the last one said that and they do the study every 6 months for a 20-year horizon. So they take 20-year data and they do it every 6 months time, and pretty much the results are the same every time you do the study. And what they've seen is that the S&P 500, which is a broad-based index in the US, has delivered maybe 6% over the last 20 years, which I think is great. And Indian would have made around 10% into 11% if you add dollar appreciation. But an average investor in the US has actually only made 2.5%. So there's a 4% difference between the returns that an average investor makes versus what you would have got if you just invested in the S&P 500. Now, what is and this is called the behavior gap. And so behavior gap is extremely important. What fund you invest in matters less. Obviously your asset allocation is important, but your behavior is the most important. And I think your behavior really drives what sort of return you will get in the long run. And to be a good investor, the reason why Warren Buffett is a good investor is not because he's a good stock picker. He's a good stock picker, but I think his behavior is what really drives or is responsible for the amount of success that he had the last 50-60 years. But essentially, what is behavior? What people and this is a combination of many biases. So I'll give you a technical definition. I'll give you the simpler one. So one is called hindsight bias, which we talked about earlier, which is chasing returns. So inevitably, what happens if you chase returns? You'll always be buying funds, and you'll sell them. You buy other funds and all of that. You'll also end up buying sector funds, and I think sector funds are extremely risky. They require market timing, all of that. So I think one is obviously hindsight bias, which plays a big role. The other one is called loss aversion. So what happens is people, when the markets crash or when the markets don't do well, they tend to be underinvested. In fact, a lot of people tend to sell their investment because they don't want to make further losses. This is a big problem because essentially smart investors do the opposite. If you look at 2010, when the markets had corrected to a point where everybody was talking about a Great Depression coming back, you had two guys, Warren Buffett and this guy called Howard Marks of Oaktree. They were pouring like 5, 10, 15, 20 billion in the market because they really understand the value of investing in bad times. So that's very important. I'm not saying you should invest in bad times. We don't know what bad times are. We don't know what I think market timing is extremely difficult, but I think it's important to invest in good as well as bad times, not only good times. And third is that you tend to I forgot the technical definition, but you need to what people do is they tend to overinvest in good times and underinvest in bad times. So if you look at most of the money that comes to the market today, I think in India you had a peak in 2017 when small cap and mid cap was at its absolute peak. So people tend to see past returns, and instead of doing SIP, they tend to do crazy lump sums Like in the US, people poured crazy amount of money in 2007. They are now pouring crazy amount, like the crazy amount of money in the markets today. So essentially, people tend to invest too much in bear and too less in, invest too much in bull markets and too less in bear markets, which is why the returns are, I would say, not that great because you're entering the markets at a very sort of high point, and you tend to not be active when the markets are doing badly. So these are three or four reasons to why the behavioral gap happens. And one way of mitigating behavioral gap is to do an SIP. I think SIP is probably the best concept. It's just catching on the US. It's called dollar cost averaging. But luckily in India, we have I think a lot of the mutual funds have done a great job of selling SIPs as a concept of entering markets, because in SIPs you don't have to worry about this behavioral gap because you're always sort of averaging stuff out. So I think an SIP investment form works fine, works great for investors. You don't have to worry about any of these 3-4 things, because investing in good times and bad times, you're investing in same amounts every month, and you're ensuring that you are sort of not really selling your investments prematurely. So I think SIP is great in terms of I think navigating these things. But how do you outperform the index? So now that you've understood that you can do SIP, which is a very simple way of of reducing these behavioral biases, what you can do is something called a concept called very simple rebalancing. So today, if you see most investors, they do the opposite of rebalancing. So if you have a portfolio of 5 mutual funds, you would invest more. You would invest the most in the highest performing mutual fund, and you would invest the least in the lowest performing fund in your portfolio. In fact, you might sell it. Whereas the concept of rebalancing is exactly the opposite. What it says is that you should actually invest more in the less performing funds and actually sell or slowly maybe trim your exposure to your high performing funds. And this is what gives you that alpha over the long run. If you do this consistently over say 10, 15, 20 years, you can actually beat the market, because you're just ensuring that you are buying strategies or you're buying the market at a very low base. I'll give you an example. So in 2020 COVID crisis, equity fell like crazy. So suppose you had a 80-20 equity portfolio. Your 80-20 equity portfolio would have gone to 60-40 because equity nosedived. Now a smart investor would have just rebalanced the portfolio, sold bonds or equity to take his portfolio back to 80-20, and then you get and that really, that simple move could have given you a lot more outperformance than just not doing anything. So I think I think rebalancing is extremely important, and it ensures that you're not going all out on a fund, and you're not sort of making sure that your portfolio stays stable and your risk also stays stable over a long period of time. So there's this company, you guys should check it out. It's called Index Fund Advisors. It's run by this cool guy called Mark Hebner, super funny guy. He's quite hilarious. He's written a few books, and he's been running these passive portfolios for now 20, 25, 30 years, and all of his portfolios are outperforming the benchmark because he's managed to really cut the crap, cut all these behavioral biases, rebalance well, and he's managed to really make that maybe 0.5% or 1%, whatever it is, outperformance every year through the systematic rebalancing. So that's just I think like a longish version of that question. I hope that answered the question, but this I think is a very prudent way of managing money.
Thanks, Prateek. So just to follow up, so one thing you mentioned is that an investor can be his own worst enemy in a sense, and poor decisions during bad times or when markets low, etc., can actually adversely affect your portfolio, right? And even if you've invested in, let's say, a 5-star fund or an index fund, you may actually, based on investment decisions, actually underperform the market average, which is what the target was by actually investing in an index fund. So, taking this conversation further, as per your, and I ask this because I know Motilal Oswal owns a portfolio management service. What are the kind of behaviors that you have seen, or instances, or things that that an investor should avoid to ensure that he continues to kind of build wealth? What are the kind of emergencies that do come up that all the people here should essentially watch out for.
Mm.
And the reason I kind of mention this is because we all know about lifestyle inflation and things like that. But are there, given that you have this trove of data from your portfolio management service, have you seen patterns in the way investors have approached their wealth? How does a billionaire essentially become a millionaire? That's the question. And is there something we should all look out for in our own behaviors?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, that's a great question. So wealth is, and this is something which I have seen. So wealth is built via concentration, but I think wealth is sort of staying stable and growing by diversification. So I think a lot of people who made billions or made a lot of money have made it through concentration, and this doesn't have to be stock concentration or mutual fund concentration. This basically, most people who made money is they've done it by owning equity. Berkshire Hathaway has done it by the insurance business, even though they have investments in 40 or 50 sort of different industries or companies. Their driving factor has been the insurance business, which has done super well, and now obviously we have Apple, which is doing well. So I think concentration is extremely important when you're looking at really growing your wealth very, very quickly. Unfortunately, very few people get concentration right. Most people get concentration wrong. They take wrong bets, or they have these behavioral stuff which leads them to not really make best decisions. Which is why today I think the best form of investing is diversification, which is essentially making sure that you're making your 10% and maybe 12% every year through sort of I think regular sort of investing in different asset classes and rebalancing your portfolio every year or two. So that is what I think I think most investors are doing. I do think that the best way for an average investor is to also follow that same approach, is to have your money split in different asset classes and not really have too many investments, in the sense that if you have 5 mutual equity funds versus 15, there is really no difference that you can make your portfolio. I think you should stick to maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7 maximum mutual funds, and these mutual funds should be I think across different asset classes, like debt, equity, international, gold, maybe real estate if you want. So I think having investors who have showed that they are able to I think keep discipline during bad times and also diversify and rebalance have actually made the most amount of money. What I think where people have gone wrong is speculation. I would say maybe 90-95% or maybe more, maybe 99% of traders lose money. So people, especially younger folks, I think who go out there and open broking accounts, trading accounts, and trade with the thing of creating wealth, that often sort of lose money. So I think it's important to understand that yes, it's not bad to trade, it's not bad to speculate, but just do it with a small amount of your money. Do it maybe what you can do is put 90% of your money in something diversified, something long term, and then you can play around with those 10%. And if you do well, obviously then you can increase that exposure. But it makes sure that you're obviously creating wealth, but you're also giving your mind space to learn and I think and just see if you can beat the market by picking stocks now. So I think that's what I've seen. Third thing what I've seen, especially with the PMS business, and these are relatively wealthy folks, is that they and this is a big problem in India. A lot of, in fact, I've written an article which I can share on the group after this call, which talks about why the worst investors in India, and I have some data to prove this, that are end up being ultra HNIs and family offices, because if you look at a businessman today, they have done phenomenally well in capital allocation in their own businesses. And they feel that if I can do well in capital allocation in my own businesses, I'm sure I can beat the stock market. So they have this sense of overconfidence when it comes to I think I can choose my investments. So essentially what happens is a lot of people, and this is a lot of HNIs who are very hands-on, end up speculating and buying these products because they're high return, because they feel that this will go up, and they're following their hunch. But essentially, I think they're not able to do that, and which is why they end up selling the portfolios at losses and buying it at high. So I think we've seen a lot of people in PMS and also AIFs who just enter products and sort of exit products in 1 or 2 years' time. These products are meant for you to be there for 5, 10, 15 years. That's the whole point of putting your money out here. It's supposed to be long term, but they get disappointed with returns and they sell it. So I think there is in fact, what data we have shows is that the best investors, and this is also proven in the US, tend to not be finance folks. They tend to be doctors, lawyers, who have no understanding of the stock market because they don't really do much. They just they have the savings mentality where they just put their money every month and just forget about it. So I think that's a great, I think lesson, and also it shows that having an information advantage in finance does not, in fact, it might play against your returns over the long term. So I think these are some more things that I've learned in so far.
Thank you, Prateek. Over to you, Bagheera.
Yeah, that was quite a interesting question and a detailed answer. I think we should reiterate the golden advice that we should not over allocate during the good times and under allocate during the bad times, and that through an SIP we can dollar cost averaging and have the best returns. Keeping it simple is the easiest way to grow wealth, it seems, and just the way Prateek has mentioned, we have a lot of data to back that up. Following up, we have another audience member with yet another interesting question. So I would ask Backpacking to please ask.
Prateek?
Hi.
Yeah. So the question I had is, what kind of career opportunities do you see popping up in the fintech area of your asset management and AMC kind of fund? So, and what kind of qualifications should one try to get into that area?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the audience, to give some context, apart from me, heading passive funds at MOAMC, I'm also CEO and founder of a company called Glide Invest. It's essentially a robo advisory that helps automate investing for a lot of folks. Investing, so it's essentially with index funds. So you can essentially get a portfolio that's diversified, that's invested in index funds, so you can save fees, and also we do the asset allocation, rebalancing, all of that. So the idea behind the company is to not only be a platform where you can choose between 5,000 6,000 funds, but to actually give you a solution. It's more built on advisory than I think giving choice. So I think that's it's from that context. I've spent a lot of time in fintech in the Valley. Spent time in fintech in London, where I was studying, and also worked for a couple of companies there. I do think that today I think it's less about degrees and more about skill. I think the value of education is fallen dramatically. If you look at the Bay Area, companies don't care what school you go to. Companies don't care what your GPA is in your school. What they care is that and is what you bring down to table in terms of skills. And even an MBA, I have an MBA, but it's not. And I have an MBA from a decent school, but it still didn't really help me get a good job. I mean, I sort of ultimately got a good job, but it actually worked against me because people kept asking me that, what is your skill? I mean, are you? We don't want a person, who can do a bit of everything. We want someone who can either do, say, performance marketing or growth marketing, or maybe a full stack developer or whatever. So there's traditional finance, which is more like banks and NBFCs and stockbrokers. They tend to have these MBA types, which is fine. I think it's fine to have, and then they call the shots and all of that. But if you look at fintech, it's actually not that way. You have these people who have specific skill sets like product management, design, marketing, engineering, and also sort of accounting or finance. So I think what's going to happen, or at least what I see happening, is there's going to be an increasing trend towards skill-based hiring, which we do at Glide as well. I don't really care when I'm hiring, I honestly don't look at the education section. I don't care if you went to school or not. Also, it's fine if you don't go to school, but we have extensive, I would say. We have tests that we have for each of the verticals. We have like a proper interview sort of process to ensure that we get people with skills. So I think skills is extremely important, as I said. So people looking to break into fintech should look at really what is the one skill that you can put on the table. There is no and can you develop that over time? And also I think your education does not give you that skill. Just because you went to an engineering school does not mean that you can code. I think that two things are extremely different. A lot of people who went to engineering school actually don't really know a lot about code. So I think you have to really be able to invest in the skill set and make sure that you are able to build something like a portfolio out of it and sell that to your prospective employer.
Thank you. I think a lot of us are also keeping an eye on this space. So, just as a follow-up question on Glide Invest, do you think there is space for another mutual fund app for Glide? I mean, we're all saturated and spoiled for choices in this space, right? We have we have like 10, 15 popular apps. So how does Glide Invest make space? How is it different than any other app out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the whole point about Glide is to not really become a platform. So if you see a lot of mutual fund apps, they give you access. They give you access in a very easy UI, very simple UI, and user experience, all of that, and also makes it easier for people to onboard and participate in the financial markets. But what I have seen is that a lot of these companies also need the user to make decisions. So the user has to take a call about what stock to buy, what stock to sell, or what fund to buy, what fund to sell, and I think the whole concept about robo advisory or automated wealth advisory is for the user to just give you or the app data about what the requirements are, and the platform should suggest as per their requirements. These are the investments. This is the percentage your asset allocation. And these are the funds that you should invest in. So I think that segment has not really taken off. If you look at the US, the only way a retail can really participate in, or at least in investing or creating a portfolio, is through, say, a portfolio management application that gives you access to multiple ETFs where it gives you the allocation and it does everything for you. Whereas in India, you have a platform approach where you have a platform and you can go out there and choose. And effectively, what I've seen is that unlike e-commerce, where if you want to buy, say like a yoga mat or like a camera, you know what to buy. Whereas mutual fund is a little bit complicated. It's like trying to choose between 10,000, 5,000 hair dryers, and all are pretty much very similar. So I think in that case, you need some advice, and especially this entire movement where direct investing is coming off. They still, you still require some sort of advice to make sure that people don't make these biases that I talked about. So that's why Glide Invest wants to come in. So we want to be an advisory company where we do the asset allocation, we do the rebalancing, we do the portfolio allocation, all of that. Investor has to either tell me how much they want to invest or what their goal is, and the rest is taken care of by Glide.
Sounds good. So just to clarify, is it auto advisory only, or can we get hands-on on your app as well?
It's both, yeah. So it's auto advisory also, but you can also, there's a advice section where you can select any of the mutual funds you want.
Right. So how long has it been around and how has been the feedback so far?
Yeah, so it's been around for about, I would say, so we launched maybe beginning of this year, so it's been around for like 4 to 5 months time, and the feedback's been great, to be honest. I think a lot of people who have been using it really love it. We haven't got like crazy amount of traction on the app because obviously we do feel that robo advisory requires some time for people to go out there, and I would say there is a fair bit amount of education required for people to really understand what we're trying to do. But I do feel that people over time will be able to. I think there's a huge section of the population that has no idea about investing is, and this is what that section we're trying to go towards.
Right. So it's still early days.
Yeah.
So the next question comes from the audience. So you're head of a passive fund arm of the Motilal Oswal Asset Management Company, right? So it wouldn't it would be right to assume that you have pretty high conviction on passively managed funds. But you have said that you have been investing in an actively managed fund for 7 years. So what's your rationale behind this?
Yeah, the rationale is simplicity. I mean, I do have investments in passive funds, but they're like super small. Like I would say I'm 99% that one fund, and maybe 1%. I'm trying to build an SIP book in international books and all of that in international funds. But yeah, I mean, essentially, the idea is that I really want peace of mind and simplicity. Which is why I did start investing in a fund 7 or 8 years ago, and the money has just been going there for the last 7 years, and I don't really want to change that. If I had to sort of start a new or maybe start investing in a newer fund, then it'll probably be a passive fund. But honestly, it's just simplicity more than anything else, to be honest. I don't want I think to manage a portfolio. And it's actually a very good strategy. If you look at what's his name here? What's the guy's name who did modern portfolio theory? Anyway, the guy who created modern portfolio theory, he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he said that in the 1970s or 80s that you really don't need more than 40 or 50 stocks in a portfolio. So the diversification ends after the I think 40th or 50th stock. Pretty much from there it's the same. So people buying 5-6 mutual funds today, I think it's fine to have different strategies in a portfolio, but essentially you don't really need more than 40-50 stocks in a portfolio as long as it's diversified across sectors. So this is what I'm looking at. I think 40-50 stocks, maybe less than that through this fund. But the idea is that I have high conviction in the fund. It's managed by Ramdev Agarwal, who is obviously a big mentor of mine, who's done super well, and the performance also has been really great if you look at it for long term. So I think just to keep it simple, to be honest.
Essentially sticking to an investment philosophy, right? Which is more than fair. Yeah. So thank you, Srinivesh, for shouting out Harry Markowitz. That's the person
Yes.
Pradeep was talking about. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for answering that. So the next question also comes from the audience. Do AMCs have a preference from where the investment comes from? So like, should it come? Is it preferable for an AMC that the investments come from the AMC website or mutual fund utility or Kuvera or etc. etc.
Yeah, I mean AMCs for AMC. Yeah, I mean I would love people to come to my website to transact, because as I said, I said earlier this EMA that we pay about 60% of our revenue in transaction fees, and it's not towards buying or selling the stocks, but towards these platforms, these intermediaries in the middle that have huge fees. So if someone comes through, say, Kuvera, then it's super expensive for me. Basically, so just to give you and please take this with this is not real, but this is sort of not the exact sort of calculation, but we pay about so we pay about I think 10 to 15 rupees for every I think SIP or lump sum, one of those two things, for anyone who's coming through, say, Kuvera. Not to Kuvera, obviously, but intermediaries. We use something called BSC Star to transact. That is very expensive, So if you're looking at a SIP of 500 rupees, we are essentially giving out, 3%. So it'll take us 6-7 years to recoup that money. So it's not very profitable for us to become to Kuvera. I mean, it's fine. I think it's great. I'm more than happy to work with Kuvera or thousands of other platforms out there, who are helping us with distribution. But I think the best way, obviously, in my case, would be people come to my website directly and do purchasing, because we don't have to go through intermediary.
Right. So just to clarify why this question was brought up, basically NAV allocation on a daily basis, is one method better than the other?
No, I think it's the same. For NAV allocation, it's the same.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
That doesn't matter.
So Prateek, do you have more time to take up more questions?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So the next question is, I believe it is from the audience as well. So how's the unit allotment process different in S&P 500 index fund?
I think it's the same. The unit allocation for S&P versus any other mutual fund, the selling process is different because so what happens is I'll give you what
Sorry to
happens.
interrupt. So maybe I can clarify on the question,
Ah.
right? So it was asked in the sense that one can see previous days S&P 500 close and place order to get NAV that reflects the top/up price, right? Which doesn't happen in Indian equity mutual funds right now. So
Yes.
in that sense, the question was asked.
Oh yeah. Okay, got it. So basically, what happens in S&P 500 is that, and it's different for the Nasdaq, so it's completely different. Speaking specifically for the S&P 500 index fund, which we launched last year, is that the NAV that you will get for the S&P 500 is based on the close of S&P 500 yesterday. So the S&P in the US closes at about 2 a.m. So whatever the NAV is as of 2 a.m. Is what the customer will get today if they invest. So essentially, a customer could effectively look at the performance of what happened in the S&P yesterday and invest today, and that is what they would get. That would how it works in terms of NAV allocation for this fund. So essentially, if the S&P 500 did go down by 2% yesterday, then and if they invest today, they will be getting that benefit. So this is how it works. But in terms of execution, it's very simple. Whatever money we get today before 3 p.m. to 45, we would essentially convert that into USD at around between 4 and 5 p.m. And about 7 p.m. when the market opens, we deploy that money between 7 and 8 p.m. So essentially we are deploying the money the same day it comes in to make things efficient. In terms of redemption, yes, it takes a while. So because the US has a T+2, so it takes 2 days to redeem from the US, and then it takes another 2 days to redeem from our custodian here in India. So your money while selling will take, I think, 3 to 4 days or time, maximum 5 days for it to come back to your bank account.
Thank you for clarifying that. I believe that is one of the most commonly asked queries about the fund, at least in our community, right?
Yeah.
So the next question comes in from a user named Jigafa. Sorry if I'm messing up your name. What are the qualities you look for in a fund manager before investing in any mutual fund?
Qualities of a fund manager. I would say that I think this is very important. So most people tend to just look at blind returns and invest, which may not be a good strategy. But I think it's important for people to take one level deeper approach when investing. So they should look at the fund manager philosophy and their execution. They should see, why, if there are certain stocks that they've bought in the portfolio, why have they bought it? What is the conviction? And what is the overall strategy of the fund manager? Some fund managers might be value focused, some managers might be growth focused, some managers might be momentum focused. So I think it really depends on what is your strategy, and the fund manager should ideally stick to their strategy for long term. So if a fund manager does digress from their strategy, then it is a bit of a problem because that means that basically the fund manager is not really keeping with what they have previously said, and if they're not able to answer questions about why they purchased certain stock, then it's problematic. So I think it's important that investors keep a close eye, not close eye, but maybe once a quarter, look at the portfolio and just see that why have they made those sort of decisions. I do think that AMCs are extremely sort of transparent, at least most of them. So they'll be more than happy to give you the explanation and all of that. Obviously, you may not be able to get access to a fund manager because they're obviously busy and all that, but they will be able to give you enough information for you to figure out why certain changes in the portfolio and what was the sort of rationale behind them. So I think that's something which I would see when I'm investing in a mutual fund. But yeah, I mean that's what I would do.
Thank you, Prateek, for the answer. We have one very interesting question coming up. What would be your suggestions to the entrepreneur in the audience today? So we have quite a few entrepreneurs in our audience, and we also have a pretty interesting background, having worked in the Silicon Valley and with VCs. Could you walk us through how it was like, and especially your learnings around how to take a product to maturity? Would you have any stories around that?
Yeah, thousands of stories, mostly bad, you know. So I think entrepreneurship is or at least I mean, I wasn't really an entrepreneur in the Valley, but I because we were a small company, I worked very closely with the founder, and it is a lot of pain, to be honest, running a company anywhere. I mean, I think if you need motivation to run a company, then I think that's not really why you should do it. I think you really have to be irrational, and it could be a little bit of you have to have some level of maybe stupidity, because you have to persevere like crazy, and there'll be times when it's just you're close to being bankrupt or close to shut down and something happens. So I think that's happened to at least the company that I was working at in the Valley many times. We were always firefighting, on a daily basis, some problem coming up. Even I think fundraising was extremely challenging. It took us good 4 months to raise money, and I think it was a very. I mean, people say that funding is easy, but it's actually extremely difficult. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and essentially even after funding, you sort of are exposed to this treadmill, which you have to keep on running, and growth and all that. So I think, I think my advice would be that you should be crystal clear of why you want to start companies, and you should be a little bit extremely passionate and a little bit, stupidly passionate, because otherwise you won't really persevere when you're going through a bad time, and, because there will be many bad times. There will be times when your key employee will leave. There will be a time when I think your main I would say customer, who is 80% of revenue, will go to someone else. You'll have times when you won't have salaries to pay to employees. So I think it's a combination of a lot of hard conversations, combination of really hustling, and really I think just making sure that you survive. I think what I've learned is that I think survival is extremely important, and for a startup, I think that should be the most important goal in the first, say, 2 or 3 years time. And once you sort of got to that survival mode, then you can go there and thrive. I also believe that at least, and this is something which people don't talk about a lot in India. I believe that a lot of these companies are VC backed, but you really have to. There is no really any model for you to, I think, for you to go out there and create value. People feel there is this lockstep sort of thing where you have a tech company, you go Series A, Series B, Series C, you go to SoftBank, you go IPO. That's a very that's what you hear of in the news, but there are hundreds and thousands of other ways to build companies, which is very important. So I think you have to really figure out what your path is, and really figure out the pros and cons of why you want to take that specific path. I mean, having $10 million raised money is a good feeling for you for 5 seconds, but then after that it's pure grunt work for the next 6 to 8 months. So I think so it's very important for you to really introspect and know who you are as a person. But I would say in terms of stories, I don't know. I mean, there's so many stories, but there's I would say that my biggest learning has been that for you to pitch, and this is something which is a very interesting story, which may be relevant for a lot of you who are going out there and raising money from venture capitalists. And so when we first started pitching to VCs, and I was part of that team that was going out there and pitching, we had a plan in mind. We had a very crystal presentation, but our presentation, and we were all like nerdy guys. So the presentation tends to be a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more complicated. And what we realized is that the simpler your presentation, the simpler your pitch, the easier it is to get funding. So we simplified our presentation by 10x or 20x, and that made it a lot easier for people to understand, because VCs are not really folks who are from the industry. There's a regular guys, MBA types, so they will be understand some of the jargon that we use. The second is what I learned is that you have to think big. So for a VC, when this is for a VC in the US or any investor in the US, doesn't have to be VC. They make multiple bets. They make 30, 40, 50 bets, and for them, and when they make 50 bets, they for them to I would say make money, they have to ensure that that one bet can encapsulate the losses of say 20 bets. So they are banking than 1 out of 20, 25 startups, which is the hit rate. But that hit rate has to be huge. That has to be like a multi-billion-dollar company or something like that. So you have to sort of really think big and able to convince them that we have a big vision. So when we started pitching it, we pitched as say a $5 or a $6 billion AUM fund in 4 or 5 years, but that didn't work. And we just multiplied that 5 into 6 times. So we made it 30 or 40 or some number, some crazy number, and we had the audacity to go out there and pitch that. That actually worked a lot better. So what we learned is that for a venture capitalist, if he makes say a 5x or a 6x of an investment, that's a write-off for him. He doesn't really make any money. For him to make money, he has to make 100, 200x, 500x. So you have to be able to have that vision. I will grow 500x in say 5 or 6 years, 10 years, whatever it is. So I think big and keep it simple. That's the two things that I've learned, and after that it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I hope the audience member were taking inspiration from it. Raising $10 million is just the starting, and since the venture capitalists have to take so many bets, that means you have a good shot at raising capital and starting your venture, and you should not just sit back thinking that whether you will be able to raise money for it or not. There's plenty of money in the world. Anyway, following up, we have Pisha, a member from the audience, and he would like to ask you a question.
Trouble here. Thank you for doing this. Great fan of Glide, especially the user experience. Super kudos for that. So the question really was that we've seen we've observed over the past 5 to 7 years, especially in the US, a greater adoption of passive funds, and a lot of the startups such as Betterment, Wealthfront are also using that and building on top of that. But we now also have a separate breed of startups such as Wise AI, especially in the US, which is trying to offer more personalized services and at the same time managing assets on a very standalone level. So creating a unique portfolio for perhaps every investor using the tech behind it. So the question really was, do you see that trend of personalization or rather hyper-personalization coming to India as well? Or do you see that we still have some time, especially in the template fund or the managed funds business?
Yeah, I definitely think that I think people like choice. I think even Wealthfront, to be honest, has pivoted to something a lot more customized. So I think if you look at Wealthfront, their current portfolio management or the way they build portfolios is that if you want to say replace say I don't know some mid cap or some large cap fund with an active like an ARC or something, you can actually do that. So they do provide personalization and customization. Maybe it's hard to do it digitally because you don't really have access to a lot of data. Today in wealth, the only really data you have is the customer's risk profile, and that's about it. You don't really have data on his needs and wants and all of that, which obviously will happen over time. But I do think that I think customization is probably going to be the first step, where a customer is able to customize his portfolio based on his needs and wants, and over time there will be personalization. I think with more and more data coming in and with all of that. So yeah, I mean, I do agree. It may not be the best thing for an investor, because what happens is if you do customize it, then people might have those chasing returns sort of a phenomena where I want to buy that fund that has delivered 40% in the last 3 years and all of that, which may not be good for your long-term portfolio. So in one way, it may not be good for you, but in the other way, it might make it easier for the platform to sell its products because they can customize it. So I think there's pros and cons of each. I do believe that personalization is going to be a big way going forward in finance. And yes, I think no one's managed to do that well so far. I haven't seen any companies, but I do believe that as more and more data gets harvested from customers, or at least not bad data but good data about their needs and wants, then it will make it relatively less difficult.
Also, Pratik, just a second question was that a lot of these, new age players have a challenge that they have the number of users or the critical mass in terms of number of users with them, but it's difficult to garner the similar degree of AUM to kind of actually be profitable as a business. And there's a report by Citi which also states, that 91% of the older millennials, which probably have the bulk of the money in the markets right now, kind of prefer to invest via an intermediary, like a phygital intermediary of sorts. So, like, how do you intend to, sort out this problem? Obviously, Glide has a pedigree associated with it, but for other startups out there, like, how would you recommend to kind of do away with this particular problem?
Yeah. No, I think it's a problem that I think we've I don't know, maybe the startup ecosystem has sort of put on themselves. I think direct mutual funds may not have been the best idea when it happened. I think 2 or 3 years ago. I think because because essentially what's happening is today people are using. So if you look at the monetization strategy for a lot of startups in at least the wealth management space, I think direct mutual funds tends to be an area where they can acquire customers, but then there is a lot of cross-selling, upselling happening. You have gold, you have insurance, you have broking, you have. I think it's more of a customer acquisition tool. And I think what's happening is you're cross-selling a lot of things which may or may not be good for the customer. So, for example, acquiring customer by something as long-term investing in mutual funds and then cross-selling broking may not be a good thing for the customer because the platform is optimized to sell you for you to speculate, which is actually a very not great thing to do. I think people should not get into speculation. So I do think that it's in the US is actually the opposite. So I think broking in the US is free of cost for most platforms, but then they cross-sell management. So if you see most of these platforms in the US, they charge you 25 basis points, 30 basis points, 50 basis points, which I think is a fair number based on your AUM and assets. In India, I think it's the opposite, where wealth is free, and I think broking is where you can make money. So I think India is a fairly different market, but I do believe that the entire sort of game from subscription is going to take off in a very big way. You are seeing it at say platforms like Smallcase, where they have managed to monetize through having these subscription models. So I think a lot of this distribution through regular plans which has happened in the US in the last 20-30 years. So now most investors in the US pay their wealth manager. They don't pay the AMC, who then indirectly pays the wealth manager, which is also fine. They would essentially pay the wealth manager directly, which is probably what's going to happen in India over the next 10 years, and that's where you'll see a lot of these platforms succeeding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pisha, for the question. The next one is pretty interesting because it has to do a lot with Motilal Oswal and US funds. So, it's regarding the SEBI limit for foreign funds and USD remittance. So recently they upped the limit to $600 million for international investment from 300 million. So, and we have also seen a lot of inflows into the NASDAQ and S&P funds as well, and other international funds as well. So, should we expect SEBI to keep increasing this limit whenever the need arises? Or are they going to restrict it to some theoretical limit, or might not extend it the next time the need arises? And how could that affect us?
Yeah, this is a big issue. The one reason why I have sort of sleepless nights, maybe once every 6 months, is because of this particular issue. In fact, most people don't know this, but in August of last year, we had to curtail some inflows, which was not great for us as a brand, because we were, I think, very close to reaching that limit. And as an AMC, we're very conservative in terms of regulation. We don't want to, I think we want to stay within regulations at all times. So it was not great for us, but luckily, I think, gratefully, I think SEBI increased the limits in August, and they were extremely gracious about it. But I do believe that with rising interest of international funds in various AMCs, I think back in August we were the only AMC fighting it. Now you have 4 or 5, or maybe 4 or 5 AMCs who are all sort of fighting this, not fighting it, but at least requesting the regulator to have a more concrete sort of set of regulations instead of having the $600 million, which is very arbitrary. And the problem is that the 600 is allocated in equal amounts across all AMCs. So even AMC with zero international funds has the same limit as an AMC, which has now close to, I think $700 million in assets. So we have not crossed the limit, but we obviously are, in terms of our projections, we will be hitting or being very close to the limit by the first week of June. And we are working with the regulator closely on this, so hopefully we'll have something in the next couple of weeks or maybe next week itself. But yes, this is because if you look at the regulations, the overall limit is $5 billion, or I think $7 billion, and we're barely like crossed, I think 1.5 or something like that. So we're very far off from that existing limit, and this limit was set in like 10 years ago, or maybe actually not 10 years, 14 years ago in 2007. So I do believe that SEBI, or maybe the regulator should maybe make it. So yeah, this is a issue, but I am very positive that they will increase the limits for AMCs and make it easier, because now you have multiple AMCs who are, I think, very close to this physical limit that they've set.
Thank you for answering that question. That was rather interesting. So fair to say that the trend will be towards the increasing side, right?
I hope so.
So the next question is a bit personal, so you can choose to ignore the question and not answer if you want. But it would be interesting to know what a day in your life is like, right? So you're handling multiple responsibilities, effectively heading two different businesses. What is it like a single day at work for you? Do you have any nugget of wisdom to share with the audience on time management, on prioritization, etc.?
Yeah. I think prioritization, the thing is, I don't like having a day in the life. I'll probably get bored as a person if I had like one specific. I think the whole point about a day in the life is to keep on ensuring that you have a different type of a day every month. So I do believe that say now I have a team of like 40, 45 people. And a year and a half ago, which is 3 of us. And the index funds business, I was alone. So when I did my first NFO, I did all the research, I did all the sales, I did all the marketing, I did all the ops. It was exhausting. It was not the paid, but I think now I obviously have a team in place, so I can focus more on thinking. But I think the problem with me right now is that obviously the index funds business has completely exploded. In the last 2 years, our AUMs have just gone up the roof, which is obviously it's a great thing. But I think the demands on that have gone up also a lot in terms of I think talking to customers, talking to partners, and all of that. And my big focus in this business is to start delegating and automating a lot of these things that I do, so that I can, because I think as entrepreneurs, we tend to, at least I tend to, fill my calendar every hour, every 30 minutes, and all of that. But the problem with that is that a lot of the creativity comes from sitting and thinking. So people underestimate the power of just sitting and thinking, and that's what I am now sort of trying to do with my time. So I have maybe an hour or two where I'm just doing some research, and thinking about strategy, all of that, which I think is a lot more important, because now a lot of the softer aspects within my verticals, whether it be Glide or the passive funds, I have a team in place for a lot of those things. So I think maybe a day in the life could be different on most days depending on where I'm working. I tend to do a combination of both index and Glide. Most people tend to sort of do the other way around, which is spend 2 days here and 3 days there. But I've tried doing that. I really couldn't do that. Stuff keeps coming up. But yeah, the huge focus on my part is to, I think, automate or delegate a lot of repeated tasks, and find more time and space to think and to sit and think and thinking about the future and all of that. So I think that's something which I believe is sort of creative.
Thank you for fielding that question, Pratik. So the next question comes from two users actually. Do you have any advice on how investors should split allocation between Indian and international markets for their personal portfolios?
Yeah, I think I think you should look at I think at 20-25% is pretty good. That's that's a good range to have. 15 to 25% is something that you should be looking at. I think it should be substantial. The reason why I say substantial is because if you have the whole point about investing your money internationally is not is diversification, you know. So it's for diversification, low correlation, dividends, buying the dollar, all of that. So for you to reduce the risk of your portfolio, if you invest just 2 or 3% of your portfolio, then there's just some other fund in your portfolio, doesn't really matter. But if you invest say 15-20%, then it becomes a core part of your portfolio, and then you can see the impact of diversification percolate the rest of your portfolio. So I think it's an asset allocation decision, which is why I think 15 to 20% or maybe 25% makes sense in internationals.
Fair enough. Thank you. So the next question comes from Reddit user Ayush. The question is, if a fund from one's portfolio has underperformed the benchmark and its peers in a given year, should one change that fund, or should there be another criteria to change the fund? And what should be that criteria if not?
Yeah, I wouldn't think too much on underperformance and outperformance and all of that. I would say just stick to the fund here. I mean, unless you're buying a sector fund, which is obviously a lot more riskier, so sector funds require some element of market timing. Most people tend to buy sectors when they're peaking, and because that's when everyone's talking about it, which is not the best time to invest. You have to invest before that. I would say if you're buying a broad-based fund, which is across different, if you like the strategy, if you like the fund manager outlook and what he or she's trying to do, then stick with it.
Stick to the investment philosophy, right? Once again, thank you. So the next question comes from Sci-Fi. When will the new app and new website be launched for Motilal Oswal AMC? Do we have any timeline for that?
Yeah, so website is next month in June, hopefully end of May. It's been delayed by a long time, but I think the app will, the work on the app will start. So essentially, unlike most of our traction happens on a website, so like the web app instead of the actual app. So the app will happen after that. So maybe a few months after we launch the website is when the app will be, the new version of the app will be launched. But yeah, I mean, it's quite terrible. The website today is about 10 years, actually more than 10 years old. We built it a long time ago. So it heavily requires some changes. So maybe if we manage to do that, and hopefully by end of May or maybe first half of June is when you'll be able to see a brand new user experience.
Thanks for providing the timeline. We have some fun questions coming up. So.
Sorry to interrupt, Bagheera. I think your voice is a bit less audible.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a rapid fire round coming up for you, Prateek. So let's begin with it. So which one would you select? R/Wall Street Bets or R/investing?
R/Wall Street Bets because fun.
Yeah. Bloomberg or Financial Times?
Ooh, FT.
FT.
Yeah, Financial Times.
Tea or coffee?
I would say coffee.
Coffee. So we know Prateek's a coffee person. Buffet or Munger?
Ooh, Munger.
Munger. Okay. Value or growth?
Growth.
Mumbai or Bangalore?
Bombay.
Mumbai.
From
and London or SF? San Fran?
I would say London.
London. Yeah. So that was our quick round on rapid fire questions. One other question we have is that have you ever tried taking stocks? So
Taking stocks?
Yeah. So we remember that the other day you had mentioned that you're not so good with picking stocks, at least not as a professional fund manager or Mr. Market for that matter. So what's the story here? Did you ever try your hands and blew up your account, or did you have any YOLO stories from your youthful days?
Yeah. So as a mutual fund, because I work in a broking enterprise and also mutual fund AMC, I'm actually not allowed to pick stocks as per compliance, because obviously there's a wall. I would say, I mean, it can be deemed as insider trading and all of that. So so I think that's just right now. And I wouldn't want to pick stocks because honestly, I don't have the time or the space to go out there and analyze companies. But I have picked stocks, but that was like 2000. That was like in when I was in school actually. I remember when I was 14 or 15. I picked Dena Bank and Jammu and Kashmir Bank or something like that. I picked, and so I tried to try to make money in the stock market. I did an internship at a broking company, and honestly, I didn't really make a lot of money. I lost money, and after that, I realized that it's just not worth it. It's not the I mean, I saw that the data that most stock investors, unless they're obviously buying a stock for 5 to 10 years time, tend to lose money and all of that. So I think so I think that's pretty much why I've kept away from stock investing all my life. So I did try it a long time back, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and I didn't have a great experience. It wasn't a lot of fun, to be honest. I didn't enjoy it, so that's probably why I stick to mutual funds. In the US, I have some stocks that I've bought when I was there. I have like Tesla. I mean, just because I'm a fanboy, I have a few companies here and there, but that's very small investments. Doesn't really count.
Okay, so on a serious note, you invest in the Motilal Oswal Multi-Cap 35 fund, but not in any of your passive funds launched by the team. Do you worry about how it might look to your customers, or is it just the inertia that you have been keeping with the same funds and stopping yourself from moving to another fund? Or is there any meaningful reason behind this as well?
No, there's nothing. I mean, honestly, there's no. I mean, just. I mean, honestly, I think both. I'm a proponent of active funds as well. I'm not saying that passive funds are better than active funds. I'm always that passive funds are different. They're a simpler solution, and that's what I sort of keep. So I don't think that having money in active funds is bad. It's just as I said, it's more of convenience. I mean, everything is going in one fund. I don't have to track separate funds. I don't have to have a tax event if I had to sell one fund and then buy something else. And performance has been fine. So I think when you're looking at investing for say 30, 40, 50 years, it doesn't really matter what fund you invest in. As long as it's managed by someone decent and it has broad-based exposure. So that's basically what my outlook is.
Right. I hope that clears it up for the audience members as well. So it breaks my heart to end it right away, but time has come. Thank you for taking the time out to be here with us, Prateek. We really appreciate the insights that you have provided us today. I think I speak for everyone when I say this, that we are all looking forward towards to come next in the passive investing space. And it's been a good journey so far for everyone. So once again, thank you all, especially Prateek, for joining us on the weekend morning. Prateek, before we end this session, where can people reach out to you if they have any kind of queries? Maybe Twitter, email, or any other platform?
I mean, you can get in touch with me on any social channel. I'm pretty active on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I'm not really active on Facebook, but I mean, Twitter, LinkedIn, you can get in touch with me, or you can obviously send me an email at prateek@glideinvest.com. I'm more than happy to answer you back. So or even the AMC, you can get in touch with someone from AMC and just tell them I want to get access to Prateek, and hopefully I'll be able to come back to you. So I mean, I'm pretty open towards any customer interaction. I actually love interacting with customers. It always gives me a lot of insights.
All right. Thank you, Prateek, for being here. I think we can close on that.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for having me out here. Thank you, Mars. Thank you, for the recruiting session, and I really look forward to more of these things in the future. And I hope this has been super helpful for all of you there. Thank you so much.